Mark Rutte says that Europe can't defend itself. But is it really true? NATO's Secretary General just told the European Parliament something shocking. Europe cannot defend itself without the United States.
That the European Union, or Europe as a whole, can defend itself without the US? Keep on dreaming. You can't. We can't.
He warned that going it alone would require defense spending up to 10% of GDP for the European countries, double what most countries in Europe spend today. And Europe would even need to build its own nuclear arsenal. As we all know, Europe is home to some of the world's wealthiest nations, advanced industries, and powerful militaries. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Russia, with an economy smaller than Italy's, is currently better prepared for war than the entire European continent. However, there is one crucial thing everyone is overlooking in this debate. And in this video, I'll break down exactly what the numbers really tell us about who would win if Europe had to fight Russia alone without the United States. I'm Stephen Nikander Højlund, a Danish social science PhD reporting for the Danish Stream Media Group. In this video, we'll cover three key topics. First, the raw economic and financial power comparison between Europe and Russia. Second, who's actually winning the industrial war production race right now. And third, what would really happen in a non-nuclear confrontation between the EU plus UK versus Russia. Let's start out looking at the money. The European Union's GDP in 26 is estimated at $22.5 trillion. Russia's GDP is just $2.16 trillion. That means that the EU's economy is roughly 10 times larger than Russia's. Add the United Kingdom to Europe's side and that gap grows even wider. If we are then adding Turkey, another NATO member with a population of 86 million, and the number, well, grows a lot. To put this in perspective, Russia's entire economy is about the same size as Italy's alone, or slightly larger than Turkey's. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia's GDP was only 10 to 15% of the EU's combined economy, and that ratio hasn't changed much. Russia did post surprisingly strong growth in 24, around 4.3%, but here's the catch: that growth is almost entirely driven by war spending. The European Commission forecasts Russia's growth will crash to just 0.8% in 25 and 1.1% in 26. Inflation in Russia is running at a 8.9% and civilian sectors are being squeezed to feed the war machine. Russia is heading towards stagflation, low growth with high inflation, and that's a dangerous economic trap to be in. Europe, on the other hand, sits inside deep global and integrated financial networks. The euro and British pound are sort of reserve currencies, much like the dollar, just not as powerful, and that gives Europe essential unlimited capacity to borrow and finance a massive rearmament if it chose to. If the EU and the UK decided tomorrow to spend 3 or 4% of GDP on defense, still that would be far less than Mark Rutte's 10% warning, well, then their annual defense budgets would be several times what Russia can sustain without destroying its economy completely. So why does Mark Rutte say Europe can't defend itself? The answer is not about the money. It's about what Europe is actually producing right now. Russia has done something Europe hasn't. It shifted its economy into a war footing. Almost like if Russia was in a total war. Moscow expanded its defense workforce into the millions. Factories now run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In 24 and 25, Russia produced between 2 to 4.5 million artillery shells per year. On top of that, Russia imports ammunition from North Korea and Iran, adding hundreds of thousands more rounds. And how does Europe compare to these numbers? Well, in 24, the United States and Europe combined produced only about 1.3 million artillery shells. That's less than half of Russia's output, because a Russian 152mm artillery shell cost about $1,000 to produce. A NATO 155mm shell cost around $4,000 to produce. Russia is producing more shells at a quarter of the cost. Adding to this that the Russian drone factory manufacturing capacity is also much higher than Europe's. This gives Moscow a massive advantage in kind of grinding attrition warfare that we are seeing in Ukraine right now, especially on the drone front that is responsible for most of the killing at the battlefield. Now, before you think this means Russia is unbeatable, let me add critical context. Europe has a far more advanced industrial base overall. European countries dominate in aerospace, automotive manufacturing, electronics, and precision machine tools. The problem is that only a tiny fraction of this industrial capacity is currently mobilized for war production. Plans are underway to ramp up shell production into the low millions per year later this decade, but that conversation takes time and requires massive political commitment. Even something we have seen in Denmark, where I think it's only this year, maybe even next year, that shell production is being ramped up. It just takes time. So in short, Russia is ahead right now in ammunition, mobilization speed, and war readiness. So what does this mean for actual military power? Russia has been fighting a high-intensity war in Ukraine for 4 years. Its military has rotated units, learned hard lessons, scaled up drone warfare and electronic warfare. European militaries, by contrast, are fragmented. Each country uses different equipment families, different command structures, and different languages. Many European armies are optimized for small expeditionary missions, just like back in the days going to Iraq and Afghanistan. So they're not attuned to the old-fashioned large-scale territorial defense. Ammunition stockpiles are low, air defense systems are sparse, drone units are only just being formed. And here's the big one: Europe still relies heavily on the United States for critical military enablers. This holds particularly true when it comes to the intelligence part, so that's surveillance and reconnaissance satellites that Ukraine is very much dependent on in the modern battlefield. That's also something that the Americans do really well and much better than the Europeans. Also missile defense systems, Europe have some, but the US have much more. Long-range precision strike weapons, the US has a lot and Europe has some, but not nearly as many as the US. And of course the ultimate backstop is USA's nuclear umbrella. France and the UK have their own nuclear weapons, but of course that's not so relevant in this non-nuclear conventional war scenario that we are trying to paint here. Mark Rutte pointed out that the US currently maintains roughly 100,000 troops in Europe, plus some critical air and navy capabilities. Remove the American backbone and there are serious gaps in command and control logistics and firepower inside the European structure. He told the European Parliament, if you really want to go it alone, forget that you can get there with 5% of GDP, it will be 10%. French and EU officials have pushed back on Mark Rutte's comments, insisting that Europe can and must take charge of its own security. But the underlying numbers don't lie. European NATO countries would not be dominating the same way against Russia as they would with the US on their side. I think that's pretty obvious for most people. But let's dive into the question that everyone wants answered. Who would actually win in a non-nuclear war between the EU plus UK and Russia? In the short term, Russia likely holds the advantage. Russia's existing mobilization, artillery stockpile, and air defense networks, also combat experienced units, would give it an edge in the opening phase, especially near its own borders. Russia would also be the attacking part, choosing time and place. And that would likely be the Baltic countries being the obvious attack vector to link up with Kaliningrad for the Russian army. A shock attack on the Baltic states would lead to an immediate NATO defeat there, as the countries are small and haven't got much hinterland to withdraw to. If war broke out today, Europe would suffer from ammunition shortages, fragmented command, and low readiness. Russian forces might be able to seize or hold ground in the Baltic states in the early months, particularly if they achieved contested skies or air parity. However, and this is crucial, offensive operations incursions deep into EU territory are far more demanding than defensive warfare near Russia's supply hubs. Even Finland, Poland and Sweden, with their vast forests and swamps, would be much like fighting in Ukraine, only that here the NATO side would be reinforced every single day by fresh British, German, French and Italian and Spanish troops. And Russia is already stretched very thin by its commitments in Ukraine. The Russian border with Finland is longer than the approximately 1,200 kilometer front line in Ukraine. And Russia hasn't really been able to move the front line in Ukraine significantly the past year. So why would Russia be able to move a NATO front line anywhere? A two-front or wider war would strain Russian manpower and logistics to the very breaking point. European troops might be scattered, but in terms of active duty personnel, it's still 2 million people under arms. That's almost twice the size of the US Army in comparison. On the border with Russia alone, where the actual fighting would be happening, Poland has 215,000 active duty personnel, and they're raising that number to 300,000. The Scandinavian countries, they count 90,000 active duty personnel, of which Finland has 25,000 and a trained reserve base of several 100,000 people.
So how do we do it? We have conscription. 1 million have done it. We can mobilize 280,000 soldiers within weeks.
Of course, a Russian attack would hurt and shock European societies and armies that are not used to high-intensity fighting. But given Russia's inability to have any significant progress in Ukraine the past year, and the fact that war continues to occupy the Russian army and really entrench them very much, the Russian army would be destroyed, in my opinion, if it attacked the EU. You can add on top of that the Russian Air Force hasn't really been able to carry out missions inside of Ukraine since Ukraine got F-16s. Then compare that with the EU's air capabilities, and then Russia would have no air superiority whatsoever. And for now, we're actually only talking about the short run. If we're looking at the long run over the months and years, the balance would slowly tilt ever more towards the EU and the UK. If we are fighting a total and existential war with Russia, then Europe's combined GDP, population and industrial base can generate more tanks, more aircrafts, more missiles, more advanced drones than Russia can sustain. Russia's war-focused economy is already running into structural limits. Its labor shortages, its sanctions, inflation and declining civil sectors. Europe's technological edge in aerospace, electronics and precision manufacturing would eventually overmatch Russia's war production, and it would probably not take Europe much time to scale up and ramp up significantly on decisive factors like, for example, drone production. Personally, I think and hope that Mark Rutte is trying to keep NATO together by speaking to both the Europeans and the US and try to find a compromise between the two sides. And he has a point in terms of long-term security, considering the war in Ukraine ends and Russia keeps rearming, then Europe has to have some sort of defense. It is obvious that Europe is not a formidable fighting force without the US endless and cutting-edge military assets, but no one in their right mind should fear an attack from Russia right now, in my opinion. Russia could not win a war against the European countries plus the UK plus Turkey even. That is not feasible. That's not to say that Russia cannot engage in hybrid warfare and through the means of hacking and drones flying into European NATO territory, disrupt certain elements. That's my opinion, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments if you disagree or agree to this analysis. Until next time, stay safe and take care of all the animals and other humans around you.